They told me not to clean room 8, not to open it, not to even look at it for too long. My name is Jake Reynolds, and for the last 6 months, I've been the night shift clerk at the Sunspot Motel, a decaying, flickering neon relic in the middle of the Mojave Desert. The motel stands like a ghost of a bygone era, its once vibrant colors now faded and peeling under the relentless sun. The neon sign buzzes intermittently, casting an eerie glow that barely penetrates the surrounding darkness. The pay is terrible, the guests are weirder, and the owner, Mr. Garza, has one rule: room 8 does not exist. It doesn't show up on the registry. Housekeeping skips it. The key hasn't left the drawer since before I got here. I've asked Mr. Garza about it, but he just waves me off, his eyes darting nervously as if the very mention of room 8 might summon something unspeakable. "Just keep the door locked, Jake," he says, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't want to know what's in there." At first, I thought it was just a quirky management decision, a way to keep the place from falling apart. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to sense that there was something more sinister at play. The motel is mostly empty, save for a few regulars who seem to have their own stories to tell. There's Marlene, the elderly woman who claims to be a retired actress, always dressed in flamboyant clothes and heavy makeup, despite the fact that no one ever sees her leave the motel. Then there's Tommy, a truck driver who spends his nights drinking cheap beer in the lobby, spinning tales of the road that make my skin crawl. But it's the tapping that gets to me the most. Every night at 3:17 a.m., a faint knocking, like fingernails on wood, echoes from the hallway. It's not loud enough to wake the guests, but it's persistent, a rhythmic reminder that something is not right. I've tried to ignore it, but the sound gnaws at my sanity, pulling me closer to the door of room 8. Then came the whispers. I'd be sitting at the front desk, the fluorescent lights flickering above me, when I'd hear soft voices drifting through the air. They were indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. Sometimes I'd catch a word or two, my name, a plea, a warning. I'd shake my head, convincing myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. And the smell, old paper, wet earth. It wafted through the air, clinging to my clothes and hair, making me feel as if I were being pulled into a grave. I tried to convince myself it was just the age of the building, but the scent seemed to intensify whenever I passed room 8. Last night, I was alone at the front desk, the clock ticking toward 3:17 a.m. The motel was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind outside. I felt a strange compulsion to check the register, to see if room 8 had somehow made its way onto the list. But it hadn't. That's when I heard it, the tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent. My heart raced as I glanced at the drawer where the key lay, untouched. I knew I shouldn't, but curiosity gnawed at me like a hungry beast. I broke the rule. I reached for the key, my fingers trembling as I pulled it from the drawer. The metal felt cold against my skin, and a shiver ran down my spine. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the door of room 8. As I approached, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, and I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What awaited me on the other side? I took a deep breath and turned the key. The door creaked open, and in that moment, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. It started with the tapping. Every night at 3:17 a.m., a faint knocking, like fingernails on wood, echoed from the hallway. It was a sound that seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold fog. Not loud enough to wake the guests, but just loud enough to creep me out. I'd sit at the front desk, the dim light flickering above me, and feel my heart race as the clock ticked closer to that cursed hour. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the old building settling, or perhaps a stray animal scratching at the door. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Each night, the tapping grew more insistent, more rhythmic, as if it were trying to communicate with me. Then came the whispers. They were soft, almost melodic, drifting through the air like a haunting lullaby. I'd be alone at the desk, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when I'd hear them, words just out of reach, slipping through my fingers like sand. I'd glance around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway remained empty, shrouded in shadows. "Jake, you should see." The words echoed in my mind, a chilling invitation that sent shivers down my spine. I'd shake my head, trying to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, but the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from the very walls of the motel, as if the building itself were alive, beckoning me to uncover its secrets. And then there was the smell. It crept into the lobby like a thief in the night. Old paper, wet earth, and something else, something foul, like decay. It clung to my clothes and hair, making me feel as if I were being pulled into a grave. I tried to ignore it, but the scent intensified whenever I passed room 8, wrapping around me like a shroud. I noticed that the other guests seemed oblivious to it all. Marlene, with her flamboyant outfits and exaggerated stories, would sit in the lobby, sipping her tea, completely unfazed by the strange occurrences. Tommy, the truck driver, would laugh and joke, his voice booming through the empty halls, as if he were immune to the unsettling atmosphere. But I wasn't so lucky. I felt like a lone sailor lost at sea, surrounded by a storm that no one else could see. The whispers and the tapping became my constant companions, gnawing at my sanity, pulling me closer to the edge. One night, as I sat at the desk, the clock struck 3:17 a.m. My heart raced as the tapping began again, louder this time, more urgent. I glanced at the register, half expecting to see a new name written in the guest list, but it remained unchanged. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, trying to convince my racing heart. But the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Jake, you should see." I felt a chill run down my spine, and I stood up, my legs trembling. I glanced toward the hallway, where the tapping seemed to beckon me, urging me to take a step closer. I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. What lay beyond that door? What secrets did room 8 hold? As I stood there, the smell intensified, filling my lungs with a sense of dread. It was as if the very air around me was thick with the weight of the past, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I had to know. With each step toward the hallway, the tapping grew louder, echoing in my ears like a heartbeat. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling as I prepared to confront whatever lay beyond. But just as I was about to turn the knob, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. What had I awakened? In that moment, I realized that I was no longer just a night clerk at a rundown motel. I was a player in a game far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I wasn't supposed to touch the rusted key labeled 8 in the register. It was a relic of the past, a key that had not seen the light of day in years. But after a drunk trucker swore he'd checked into room 8, then vanished by morning, I felt an insatiable need for answers. The whispers had grown louder, and the tapping had become a relentless drumbeat in my mind. I had to know what lay behind that door. As I stood at the front desk, the clock ticking ominously toward 3:17 a.m., I glanced around to ensure no one was watching. The lobby was empty, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. My heart raced as I reached for the key, my fingers trembling against the cold metal. With a deep breath, I turned the key in the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me, but curiosity propelled me forward. Inside, the room was frozen in 1983. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Yellowed newspapers covered the walls, their headlines faded and illegible, as if they had been trapped in time. A single suitcase sat in the corner, half-packed, gathering dust like a forgotten memory. It was as if the occupant had left in a hurry, leaving behind a piece of their life. I stepped further into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. On the nightstand, a Polaroid photo caught my eye. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I examined it closely. In the photo, a smiling family posed together, their faces radiating joy. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unsettling. Their faces were scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase them from existence. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What had happened to them? Why were they erased from this memory? I placed the photo back on the nightstand, my mind racing with questions. The room felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. I turned to leave, but just as I reached for the door, it slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed in the small space, reverberating off the walls like a gunshot. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the door, my heart racing. I twisted the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, thick and suffocating. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sign of life outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, the whispers returned. "Jake, you shouldn't have come here." They were softer now, almost melodic, wrapping around me like a shroud. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I realized I was not alone. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. I turned back to the room, my eyes scanning the walls for any clues. The newspapers, the suitcase, the photo, they all held pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. I approached the suitcase, my hands trembling as I unzipped it. Inside, I found clothes, faded jeans, a tattered shirt, and a small stuffed animal. It was a worn teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly at me. I felt a pang of sadness wash over me. Who had this belonged to? Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "You need to leave before it's too late." I stumbled back, my heart racing as I realized I had to escape. I rushed to the door again, throwing my weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into frantic cries, echoing in my mind. "Jake, you shouldn't have come here." With one final push, I slammed my shoulder against the door, and it burst open, sending me tumbling into the hallway. I gasped for breath, my heart racing as I scrambled to my feet. I had uncovered something dark and twisted, but I knew this was only the beginning. The secrets of Room 8 were far from over, and I was now entangled in a web of mystery that threatened to consume me. The moment I stumbled back into the hallway, my heart racing, I knew I had only scratched the surface of the horrors that Room 8 held. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But the whispers still echoed in my mind, urging me to uncover the truth. As I caught my breath, I noticed the flickering light from the lobby. The old TV behind the front desk had turned on by itself, casting a ghostly glow across the room. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay away, but curiosity pulled me closer. The screen displayed grainy footage, security footage from the motel. I squinted, trying to make sense of the distorted images. At first, it was just a blur of movement, but then I saw them. A man, a woman, and a little girl in a red dress. They walked into the frame, their faces bright with smiles, completely unaware of the darkness that surrounded them. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched them. They looked so happy, so alive. But as the footage continued, something shifted. In the corner of the screen, something moved too fast for the camera to capture clearly. A shadow darted past, flickering in and out of view, as if it were playing a game of hide and seek. My heart raced as I leaned closer, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The family never checked out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I thought about the suitcase I had found in Room 8, the clothes, the teddy bear. They had left everything behind, as if they had been pulled into the void. Suddenly, the screen flickered again, and the image of the little girl in the red dress filled the frame. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were hollow, devoid of life. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I realized she was staring directly at me. Now, when I close my eyes, I see her standing at the edge of my vision. When I blink, she's closer. I stumbled back, my breath quickening as I tried to shake off the image. But it was no use. The girl was there, lurking in the shadows, her presence growing stronger with each passing moment. I could feel her gaze piercing through me, as if she were trying to communicate something important. She wants me to finish what that family started. The thought sent a jolt of fear through me. What could she possibly want? What had happened to her and her family? I felt a sense of urgency wash over me, a need to uncover the truth before it was too late. I turned back to the TV, desperate for answers. The footage continued to play, looping back to the moment the family entered the motel. I watched intently, searching for any clues that might explain their fate. Then, I noticed something, a flicker of movement in the background. A shadow, darker than the rest, seemed to follow them as they walked through the lobby. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My heart raced as I realized that whatever had taken the family was still lurking in the motel, waiting for its next victim. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I understood the gravity of my situation. I was not just a bystander. I was part of this twisted narrative. The girl in the red dress was reaching out to me, and I had to decide whether to heed her call or turn away. As the footage looped again, I felt a surge of determination. I couldn't let the same fate befall me. I had to confront whatever darkness resided in room 8 to uncover the truth behind the family's disappearance. With a deep breath, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward, and I knew I had to face the horrors that awaited me. The truth about room 8 was waiting, and I was ready to uncover it, no matter the cost. I put the key back in the drawer, my hands trembling as I covered my tracks. The weight of what I had uncovered pressed heavily on my chest, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me like a thick fog. I had seen too much, and I knew I had to be careful. The whispers had grown more insistent, and the girl in the red dress haunted my every thought. But last night, something changed. As I sat at the front desk, the clock ticking away the seconds, I glanced at the guest ledger. My heart sank as I noticed it had updated itself. A new name had appeared, scrawled in a hurried hand, Room 8. I don't know who wrote it. The letters were jagged, almost frantic, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had thought I was alone in this nightmare, but now it seemed that someone else had been drawn into the web of Room 8. I glanced at the security monitor, my heart racing as I prepared to check the footage. The screen flickered to life, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had seen enough horror to know that whatever was happening was far from ordinary. As I watched the feed, my breath caught in my throat. The door to room 8 was already opening. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my ears. The door creaked slowly, revealing a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I could barely make out a figure emerging from the shadows, but it was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't human. The shape that stepped into the light was distorted, its features shifting and writhing as if it were made of smoke. Long, spindly limbs stretched out from its body, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized that this was the entity that had taken the family, the thing that had haunted the motel for years. I stumbled back from the monitor, my heart racing as panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I had to warn someone. But as I turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Jake, you can't escape." The voice was chilling, echoing in my mind as I felt the air grow thick with dread. I knew I was trapped, ensnared in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The entity was free, and it was hungry. I rushed to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. But just as I was about to escape, the lights flickered, plunging the lobby into darkness. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and I knew it was too late. The whispers turned into frantic cries, urging me to stay, to confront the darkness that had been unleashed. I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me back toward the monitor. I couldn't look away. As the lights flickered back on, I saw the entity standing in the lobby, its form shifting and twisting, a grotesque parody of humanity. It turned its glowing eyes toward me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. In that moment, I understood the final rule. Room 8 was never meant to be opened. I had broken the rule, and now I was part of its twisted legacy. The girl in the red dress had been a warning, a plea for help, and I had ignored it. As the entity advanced, I felt a surge of terror wash over me. I was no longer just a night clerk at a rundown motel. I was a player in a game far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. With one last desperate glance at the door, I realized that escape was no longer an option. The darkness had claimed me, and I was now bound to the horrors of Room 8. As the entity reached out, I felt the cold grip of despair wrap around me, and I knew that the true nightmare was only just beginning.